There we go.
Okay.
There we go.
Hey, great. Thanks for taking the time out for this. I appreciate it.
Oh my gosh, thank you. You're a busy man.
Not overly, but I have a good pace on things, so I do a little bit of everything, but not a lot of everything. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's what I always say. I don't do any one thing full time. It's just
yeah. Well, it's nice in the psychotherapy realm. 20 hours a week is full time, so it leaves me lots of time to do other things, and so I do it.
oh,
It's,
oh, that's great. So I heard somebody mentioning you this morning. I'll back up and give you the background. I'm not sure if you have probably heard of Sean Conahan, who does he runs a podcast called Up Talk about
okay.
PTSD. I don't know if you've heard of him or not. Anyway, he and I went to high school together,
Oh,
so I knew he had done this podcast. So I reached out, was chatting with him. Anyway, he connected me with a husband and wife team who I've been chatting with, and his last sentence to me was, "I've never been happier. My relationship is stronger, and it's all because of Jeff." So,
wow.
yeah, Harry and Tammy,
Right.
Harry,
Okay.
yeah, yeah, he was the one that was just singing your praises,
Wow.
and I
Well,
was
nice to
literally talking with him, so it was really exciting.
sometimes you never know. It's like a fire scene. You get somebody out of a car and you never hear from them again because you never really knew. You didn't necessarily know them well. But we had an incident a number of years ago where there was a head on right there at exit 14 and hydroplaning, and one of our firefighters did the patient care and was talking to the person all the way through it, and it was an incident because with the fire, particularly when it comes to auto accidents, they're from somewhere else and they're heading
Yeah,
somewhere else. And
yeah, yeah, en
he,
route.
he was
Thank
at
you.
the Wendy's restaurant, which is 500 yards from that,
Yeah.
and she approached him. She said, "You're a firefighter." And he said, "Well, yeah." This was like, and he says, "You were the one that held my hand."
Oh,
And I wrote a poem about it. I'll share that with you at
oh,
some point. And,
goodness.
and he just, wow, that was such phenomenal. And she said, "I want to thank you. I know I lost my baby and that, and my husband died, but I got to tell you that you held my hand and you were holding on, and you were what got me through." And to have that feedback directly, first of all, she remembered him, and then secondly, she approached.
Especially in a trauma situation that she remembered him. Yeah,
Correct. So it's like,
yeah,
wow, this is why
yeah.
we do what we do, right? You don't pay us enough money for it, but the volunteer work is really important. So,
That's amazing. Yeah, to be able to have that. That's right. It's probably true. You don't hear how people do in the end. So,
yeah.
yeah. But no, Harry was singing your praises. So I was like,
Thank, thank,
yay.
thank you,
Like,
Harry.
so exciting. So I'm just going to give you my little premise and then I just want you to go. Um, So as I mentioned to you, I'm not 100% sure. Like my thesis statement, my direction that I'm taking with this 100%. I would like to focus kind of on how it impacts the family, and not just the person. How it's something hidden, so people don't understand. Kind of going at that angle. So I just want to kind of hear from your perspective, like your background working in that field and impacts, and I guess impact of not dealing with it, or can you deal with it? Are you ever over it and it being hidden there?
Yeah. Okay, so you ask a great question, and it's a very deep and complicated answer to this. So the first thing is that often when we're talking about PTSD, we talk about it in a singularity. So it's about one person who has it. We don't talk about it in terms of it being a communal problem, or we don't talk about it in terms of it being a family problem. Because what happens is, with any mental illness, um, it's like people who have working with someone on the spectrum or bipolar or schizophrenia or has a brain injury. There's an isolating experience, and then the family is sort of expected to gather around and support the person. Pain, by its very nature, draws attention to itself. So when I stub my toe, I become a sore toe with a human attached to it. And so the mentally injured person also becomes an illness with a human attached to it. And pain-centered people tend to be self-centered. And the illness becomes the sun out around which the family orbits like planets, even the person who has it. And the difficulty is that family members cannot be permitted to express how it affects them, because automatically a comparison is drawn to the PTSD, and it triggers a competition of whose pain is bigger. And then the family members are forced into silence.
So the person in themselves kind of like doesn't let the family members express themselves, kind of thing, like experiencing the pain, so I don't want to hear about how it impacts you, kind of thing, like.
Yeah. So, well, when a person expresses their pain, it lessens mine. It means mine isn't important, and that's where the struggle enters with it. So if you look at it, and I only draw the comparison because of the similarity in dynamics, but if you look at a family where an addiction is present, people don't have a lot of patience with addictions because it's usually seen as self-inflicted, but other mental illnesses sort of claim our partner without consent. And so when I have PTSD, and I'm no longer running on adrenaline, I am fractured and vulnerable to flashbacks. And the flashbacks can get triggered in any way, anyhow. There's three kinds of flashbacks. There's what I call the ticking jack-in-the-box flashbacks, which has to do with things that are actually located in the environment. So in the fire service, it will be a yellow car, or it will be a place where a house fire was, or it will be an incident that's happened that actually has now a geographical place. And so it might be the crew I was with. It might be other associated things that go along. And so what often happens is my capacity to handle stress may be a 10, but the little things, like a 2 out of 10, where we're not paying attention to it, but a 2 only takes 4 2s to make an 8. And then I don't have the capacity to even handle a 3 out of 10. But because it's a 2 and it's not an 8 like my partner, I can't talk about it.
Yeah.
So what happens is partners feel torn because they have to choose between protecting their children, themselves, or their partner. Sort of like a room catching on fire, the partner trapped inside, but the family has to close the door on that trapped person because they can't afford to have the fire go anywhere else. And that results in verbal and emotional abuse. It results in an end of patience and fighting and blaming and all that stuff. And the supporting partner is in a terrible place because they're depending on their memories of what this person used to be and the nostalgia to counteract all that stuff that's going on. So the ticking jack-in-the-box is the first thing that happens, and I get transported back to a time and place where I was stressed out. So I've talked with truck drivers, for instance, who drove in and out of the bases in Kandahar, but because they were getting supplies, they had to look out for the exploding devices on the road all the time. And one guy says to me, I'm driving back and forth from Halifax, but I find myself still keeping an eye on the edge of the road or objects on the road. He says, and I'm back in Kandahar again. I call it the ticking jack-in-the-box because also it's time-stamped. So another buddy of mine gives me an elbow and he says, everybody, in the month of May, we had talked for some time about a struggle. He was fighting pirates off the coast of Africa, and he came along and he said, I don't know what this is, but in the month of May comes along, and it's a beautiful time of the year. It's warming up. People are in happy moods. I feel like I got this black cloud hanging over me the whole time. And so as we talked about it a little bit more, I said, so, John, when were you deployed anyway? 21st of May, he said. So there's anniversaries of deployments, there's anniversaries of this incident or that incident, and it immediately transports us back to that time and place that was unfinished. So you have Romeo Dallaire driving up on the lawn in Ottawa because he's actually not in Ottawa, he's somewhere else. And so it's really hard for a person to describe what's going on. How do you say that to your family? You don't, because first of all, you're taken back to a place you don't want to go anyway, and you don't want to share with them what's going on because they won't even be able to understand it, and B, they're going to dismiss it or not handle it well, give me some really weak advice or something and say, well, just don't think about it or something like that, and it's not going to be helpful. So I get more and more isolated if I'm there. And so we don't allow or remember that when we're in close proximity to when something happened, either time-wise or location-wise, that we end up having the stress. There'll be a lot of people, for instance, that will spike because of the latest event that's going on in Afghanistan, because they're going to be back in Afghanistan.
Because you're hearing about it in the news.
And they were there, and they fought this battle, and the battle's going on. And so they'll be here, and they'll be there both. And the families don't have any way of understanding what that's about. Second type of flashback I call Pandora's box, and it has to do with the fact that when I'm feeling vulnerable and overwhelmed, anything can happen anytime, anywhere, any flashback can come because it's stored in my vulnerability and overwhelm. So I'll be sitting on the couch one day, and my son comes in and he slams the door. It happens to be this time that sounded like a bomb. Yesterday it didn't. Tomorrow it won't. But today it did, and I overreacted. And so my son is terrified because he doesn't know what's going to happen or what's going to trigger me next. And I can't tell him because I don't know. But I happen to be in a vulnerable space today. And so as a result of that banging of that door puts me back in another time and place where I was on guard at war, and my son gets to be the recipient of that stuff. And so I feel badly about it. I can't explain it. There are no words will describe it. My partner's on my ass about it. And so I'm just going to withdraw a little bit more and get a little further away. Because I don't feel like I'm safe, and I don't want to crush my kids. The third kind of flashback is what I call the black box, and that's like what records the plane. A black box in a plane records the verbal and nonverbal interactions of a flight. And so when a person gets out their 10,000 psi finger, I'm immediately transported back to a time and place where someone was doing that to me. And so what happens now is that I go to Canadian Tire and I have a 17-year-old clerk who's a little lippy and certainly not very helpful, can ruin 4 days of my life because he's taking me back to a time where someone is telling me something or screwing me around or not doing what I expected. And so I end up feeling vulnerable and overwhelmed, and I'm shot for a while. And so that happened. If that happens at Canadian Tire, I go home and my family's going, what happened to you? And I can say, I don't know. And I mean it. I don't know. So it becomes really tough. And then what happens inside of me with a person with PTSD is that as I get more and more isolated, I'm sealing myself off from those triggers. I'm actually doing what we call in the fire services creating an emotional backdraft. So I'm no longer having input from the outside world, and it's heating up inside of me to such a point where it's 1,000 degrees inside, but you can't tell that from the outside. And eventually that structure will can't sustain itself, and eventually that or someone will intervene, and I'll explode. And when I explode, there may not be enough of me left which is why I keep isolated and disconnected from other people, because I can't allow people, I'm so vulnerable, but I can't allow people to come anywhere close in case they trigger me, and that will be the last one. I'm one critical incident stress away from going up entirely all the time. And
so does that mean, like, when you say like go up, does that mean like possibly making violence upon others, or are we talking about like suicide, or both?
anything,
Anything.
suicide, anything. So it becomes, there is nothing left of me. So in a backdraft situation, when you're looking in the window, everything's in place. All the furniture is there, and it's 1,000 degrees, and everything's above its ignition point. But as soon as that air gets into that room, it's all on fire and it's all gone. And so I'm hanging on by a thread when I'm doing this backdraft situation, and nobody can really help me. And so families get into a tense situation where they can't stay, but if they go, he's going to kill himself. And so it's a really tough space. And because we don't identify that as a family issue, but more we see it as a personal issue, we don't really give a lot of resources to those around them.
So is that something we should be doing?
I don't know if we know how at the present time. And so some of my work at the moment, well, I've gone back to school to do another degree in industrial and organizational psychology, as I mentioned to you. It's because it happens to us in the fire service, where we have a chief or a leader in the department who is suffering from PTSD but refusing to stop coming to calls. And so as a result, the symptoms of his mental illness or her mental illness ends up spilling on the department, divides the department into loyalists and reformists, and then eventually the loyalists get rid of the reformists, and then you end up in a really tight supernova kind of fire department, and then it goes up. Something happens, and then the whole structure of the fire department, you lose firefighters, you lose everything, and it becomes a big dramatic mess. But the municipality has to rebuild it, but they don't know how to rebuild it any differently. So that's kind of what motivated me to do the extra schooling, to say there needs to be some way to describe this in a good language that allows us to be able to address it. So I don't have to learn psychology to be well. I can actually learn firefighting language to be well, or military language to be well, or engineering to be well. So I need to have that adapted to my language. So that's another one of the barriers that happens, is that PTSD has a language of its own, but familial language has a different language. And so PTSD is not translated into familial language. And so the solution around that is, how do you make good agreements? And then how do you stick to them? So good agreements are negotiated, and then the agreement bears the weight of those situations. Agreements made well enough in advance means there's less reaction and more planning.
So give me a situation like in a family like that.
So there's a guy that I know, a friend of mine. He has a bad corridor. So within the months of February to the end of March, he has a time when he numbs out. When he was a kid, his dad died. He had a birthday at that time. He was abused. All within that category. And so every year, and he's in his 40s now, when he comes up to that time, he finds himself not able to relate to anything because he's not here, he's back there. And so but what we've done together as a family and talking that through is to say, let's plan for the corridor. What are you going to do? How does this work? And what we have done is, in changing the pattern in advance, means that I'm going to stick to the agreement we made, and we're going to go through this. So it's something that we people decide together, And then technically it eliminates the resentments and blame. I say technically because generally it doesn't. Because when a person needs to, so let's say we're going to move across town, for instance, that's going to be disruptive to me as a PTSD person. So you may do all the work to do that. And then that disruption, when it actually I experience it, which will be in the middle of the move, I'm going to be angry with you because of the disruption, and I'm going to blame it on you, even though we might have agreed to it in advance. So what we do then is we tweak that to say, so what'll happen when the disruption hits? And let's look at whether the disruption is worth the price of moving across town. So those become things that we get to in advance, and that really takes a lot of the stress away. It's when I'm disrupted, my pain shows up, and it's the sun around which everybody orbits, and you're not orbiting me, you're not being faithful or truthful to me, and so this is where you have to have something that replaces that to say, well, we made disagreement, and so one of the technical analogies I use is in the fire service, we have this thing called the collapse zone, right? So if I'm pulling my fire truck into a place and it's on fire, I have to decide where to park the truck, because if I park it too close to the building and the building comes down, I lose the crew and I lose my truck. So immediately I do this quick calculation in my head. 1.5 times the height of the building is the distance I stay away from the base. So I can park there, and my firefighters can go in and come out, and I'm not worried about anything except them. And so if we're going to move across town, let's talk about how we're going to do that. And then we get to that corridor between February and the end of March. Let's talk about how we're going to manage that. So if I'm distancing myself from you, it's because I'm claiming a collapse zone. I'm not abandoning you. And that may be a nice concept. It's going to have to be run through a few times before the person actually trusts that they're not going to be abandoned. But that's kind of how that unfolds. So we got lots of these little analogies that we do well in the fire service that we haven't applied to mental health. And so we can use it, we can now put it into fire department language and then claim it as our own, as opposed to having to learn psychology to be well. I can actually learn how to be a firefighter and be well, just apply it in a new way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's really, really interesting. But yeah, that's interesting too about so when you're creating these like negotiations, is that something you do with like a counselor, or people can do on their own?
Yeah, it depends on the capacity of because people may not know how to do that, that's where the counselor can come in the beginning. But eventually, we want everybody to be self-managing, so that it's not dependent on anybody else. And if I'm going to if you're mentally ill and I'm going to create a collapse zone, I'm going to say to you, I'm still here. I'm just not within the range of your violence, your blaming, your anger, your rage. I'm going to be a container now, as opposed to being in there with you. You're going to feel like I'm abandoning you. I'm here. I got your back. I'm just not going to be within arm's reach of you. Yeah. That's all.
Yeah. And that takes a really strong partner, like, to be able to handle.
One has to build capacity to do that. One doesn't have that innately. And so it's the love of the couple has together that says, let's do it this way. Because I need, as a mother, if my husband has PTSD, as a mother, I'm torn between saving my children or saving my partner. My partner, which of course I don't actually know anymore, because he's not the person I married. He's now in a backdraft situation, and so I'm now having to choose whether I'm going to screw my kids up for the rest of their life and keep them here, or leave them and have him die. Well, what a hell of a choice to have to make, And so there's should be options, and so there can be healthy options with this.
Yeah, yeah. So there must be a high rate of divorce then, is there, or not?
I don't know any statistics on that.
Yeah, yeah.
I know there's a lot of people that are suffering because they don't want to abandon anybody.
Yeah.
And so they suffer quite quietly, and their pain is not noticed by people because it pales in comparison with PTSD.
Yep. Yeah. Um, so I feel like we're hearing a lot more about PTSD than we have in the past.
Yes.
Is that we are more aware, the conversation is more open, or is it just happening more?
So it was called soldier's heart in Civil War.
Yeah,
It was called
yeah.
shell shock
Shell shock. Yep.
in World War One. It was called battle fatigue in World War Two. It wasn't called PTSD and wasn't considered a mental illness until the Vietnam War. And it was on pressure from the veterans that said, no, there's a problem here. And so they began to take that more important step. And then they realized that doesn't happen just with military. And Jeffrey Mitchell and George Everly Jeffrey was a paramedic, and he did a PhD on critical incident stress management, and said we need to find a way in order to create a communal conversation about stress in advance, after an incident, before it settles into this, becomes sediment inside of a person, and that's where the critical incident stress comes in. See, critical incident stress, post-trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder are all the same. It's just a matter of degree and where they are in the continuum. I always say that having critical incident stress is sort of like getting a deep cut. Post-trauma is when it gets infected, and PTSD is when it turns septic. So there hasn't been the culture to actually support mental illness. That's coming out now, but as I reminded someone last week, we're the first generation to actually take mental illness seriously and mental health seriously. My parents' generation didn't do that.
Just suck it up.
And I don't know if you remember, but back in the early 70s, wasn't there a break-in around a psychiatrist's office because they were trying to get notes on the candidates for the Democratic Party or something? But I don't know if that was part of the Watergate stuff or what that was. But so we're talking the 70s when it was still taboo to go for some psychiatric help, right?
Yeah. No, definitely.
We're really just emerging out of this to say, I don't want to have PTSD. I don't want to do this. I want to do something different. Wow, finally. Usually we got it. We want to get rid of it. So now we can actually look at prevention, which is a whole lot different.
Yeah. And that's what we're starting to do.
Yeah.
So how do we, and that is by, it, sorry, just say, and is that about,
Okay.
one of his friends. Okay, so you said we're looking at prevention, and you also had just said something about talking about an event like right after it happened. So is that more the prevention,
Well,
or is it more before an event even happens?
so they're doing work on resiliency now,
Yeah,
which is about how to prepare someone when they get to that, and they're finding good results with that. But also remember, when I'm joining the fire service and I'm 22 years old, I don't have a lot of self-awareness. I have lots of adrenaline.
yeah, no experience in that.
And,
Yeah,
I can power through just about anything. So, and I do. And we become adrenaline junkies because we end up going for the rush, and we love that. And so we ignore stuff that is going to get in our way. I always marvel that, and I say this to my RCMP friends, that you can't afford to think about what happened yesterday because you have to be on your toes today about what's happening
yeah,
now. And so you have to store whatever it is that happened somewhere else.
yeah,
And eventually that closet gets full.
yeah, yeah, and then it comes out. So what advice do you have for family members?
Reach out.
Yeah,
Re-
to help, like,
Yeah, so there's a lot of programs that are there. I think Veterans Affairs has a program available to people who are family members. I know Health Canada has something for them as well. So there are those things available through employee assistance or through the mental health field. So it's just important though, because the biggest problem is the isolation.
Them isolating themselves.
Well, they have no, it's all happening below the words. So they don't have words. And so some of what I do when I connect with people is loan them words so they can talk about what's going on until they kind of place where they can label their own experience. But it's about, I always make this joke, partly because I'm a chaplain, but there are two kinds of spiritual groups, I say. There's the kind that stand at the door and sell you fire insurance, and then there's the kind that'll go in and get you. And so we want therapists and chaplains and people who will actually are willing to sit in the dark with them,
Yeah.
and without fear of, and let them gather themselves and begin to find their own power and to begin to walk out when they need to.
So is that something that, do you say people get over, or do we learn how to deal with it and live with it?
So there's lots of approaches to this. Depending on the goal of the therapist, and I say this, is it to cope with it or is it to resolve it? And traditional therapy with cognitive behavioral therapy gives you coping mechanisms. But to go and sit in the dark with someone and to be with them to fix the problem is a resolution. So it doesn't have to be a curse, but it's the impact that event has. So no matter how much the history is there, the impact is not history. The impact is still present, which is why flashbacks have the power that they do. They're not history, they're still here. So what happens in my mind is, if you were, let's say, to slap me across the face, I would create in my mind a wanted poster with your picture on it and stick it up somewhere in my brain, and I would hold on to that because I need to be reminded that when I see you, I need to stay out of your arm's length, beyond your arm's length. And so I'm collecting these images, and I'm collecting these images as I'm going along, and I am paying attention and giving strength to those images. So I will, after you slap me, it might be for 5 days, I'm still musing on it. I'm actually feeding it. So it's becoming it's a place where I've got my own investment in it now, and there are ways that I use through the way out technique that allows you to de-invest that energy back. When you recognize that it's an object in your awareness and how much power you're giving to it, you can then have an event but it not have the same impact. You can actually address yourself to the impact that it's having. That's my approach to it, but you'll get another clinician somewhere else that has a different approach to it. But it's really important. There is such a big gap between the fire service, emergency personnel, and therapy. It's really a problem. So,
I mean, a gap is in a lack, or?
Yeah, because I've had firefighters come to me and say, you're the third guy I've come to talk to because I talked to my first two therapists and I get halfway through my story and their eyes are rolled back in the back of their head and they're already overwhelmed and I haven't even got a chance to talk what I want to talk about yet.
Yeah.
Or I'm sitting in as a couple with a family with a couple therapist and you know I'm the firefighter and my wife wants me to tell her what it is that my flashbacks are about. I'm not going there.
Yeah.
But the therapist says, yeah, I think you should tell her. And it's like, excuse me, I'm going to punch you in the nose and I'm going to walk out and I'm never coming back because the therapist doesn't actually want to deal with it either. So the therapist doesn't want to walk into the dark with the guy. And so for me as a firefighter, I am not going to tell my wife, yeah, honey, you should have seen what that severed head was like, you know. I do not want that image in her head. I do not want to go back and visit it myself. But I'm going to torture her if I give her that stuff, and she's going to suffer from secondary trauma because of it. So I'm going to look like a selfish bastard because I'm not sharing anything.
Yeah.
But they really want to be voyeurs.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's really a tough spot, and that's the dark dynamic. And each couple has a different capacity to handle it, and each couple has a history of how much has already gone under and whether the thing can be salvaged or not.
Yeah.
Because I, my wife didn't fall in love with the guy I am. She fell in love with somebody else, and now she's having to decide: A, does she want to fall in love with me again, or does she? Is it easier for us just to go our own ways?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's,
Wow. Wow.
yeah, heavy stuff. Heavy stuff.
Dark place, yeah.
Yeah. So this is that the primary focus of your practice is.
So the primary focus of my practice is to create a language so people can begin to. I always say a critical incident stress is like trying to eat chicken broth with a fork. You don't get a lot of progress with it, but words are like croutons in the soup. So you can loan words to someone, and they'll find how it makes sense to them. It'll absorb the stress a little bit, but the skill of having to learn how to make good agreements, how to eliminate the drama, what's the characteristics of PTSD, what are the three types of flashbacks, those become really a map of what the turf actually looks like, so people know where they are as far as the GPS goes, and they have the best options to describe and define what they want to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. And it's mostly PTSD patients that you work with, or it could be anything?
No, it's um, all of us are on the spectrum of trauma. Uh,
Yeah.
you know,
Trauma specialist then, or
uh, well, it's a trauma is a human issue. An old therapist said to me one time, it's our shit that gives us character. And so when something doesn't go well, it's that struggle of what to do with it that becomes where we are with it. But so we have really early experiences of trauma that could be simply something I didn't get when I wanted it. One of the dangers of the Pandora's box is, if I'm 3 years old and I'm in the lineup with a grocery store and I can't get the candy bar, my mom won't give it to me. That's a 9 out of 10 for me, right? And then if I'm 26 and I'm at a workplace and I get assaulted by someone, that's a 9 out of 10 for me. So when the door comes off the closet and I'm vulnerable and overwhelmed, the two of them are coming out both as 9s. And it's like, that doesn't make any sense. No, it's because they are actually stored that way. And so I have to visit the perspective of the 3-year-old to say, yeah, okay, I have to let that person flush out, that part of me flush out in order to complete the experience. So what happens to me biologically is that I have a toxin in my system. My body wants to get rid of it. Does the same thing emotionally. If I have an emotional toxin inside of me, it wants to get rid of it. So the flashbacks are not zombies that are coming to eat us. They're actually there trying to get their way out. And now I might have more resources than I had when I was 3, so I can process it differently. But it starts out unprocessed. So, but all of us suffer from that, and so it doesn't matter, and there's no measurement. It's just when I have PTSD, I'm septic. And so it's at the far end of the spectrum, and then I have what I call walking PTSD, which is just my term for people that are running on adrenaline alone, and there's nothing left inside them, and they're living in the fear that if something happens, they're not going to survive, because whatever they were, they're no longer in touch with.
Yep.
So all of us have that. All of us struggle with that. All of us have drama. That's all what we do, and we all get screwed in one way or another, and so. But whether your load is 5 pounds and someone else is 50, doesn't mean that the load still doesn't weigh 5 pounds for you, and that's important, right?
Yep. Yep. And it's all important. Yeah, such an important topic and subject to be studying and helping people with. It's just something you hear about all the time. So, okay, I'm going to absorb all of this. And I said, I'm going to talk some more to Harry and all that. So when I go to put that together, hopefully I'm hoping by the end of the week, I'll be able to put this together. I'll probably be back just to ask a couple of, yeah.
I'll make this recording available to you so we can.
Thank you. Yeah.
We can just go back over it.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Thank you. That'll be a huge help because it's a lot to absorb. So yeah.
It's not a place where a lot of people venture, and it's only if you're curious or if you've been tossed in by the scruff of the neck. There's the only people that end up in this place. So
yeah, no, it's hard stuff. Okay, so thank you. So what do you do? Do you email that to me? Is that how that works?
I'll just send you the link. I'll put it in the box, or I'll put it on my webpage.
Yep.
Link to that.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff.
You're so welcome.
And for everything you do. It's just fascinating and so important. So thank you for all of that.
Thank you very much. We'll talk soon.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Bye-bye.